Hey, John.
Hey, Fred.
How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. I'm
All
doing
right.
real good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I bet you're psyched about today.
I am pumped.
All right.
Highly pumped.
All right. Welcome once again to Fred and John Talks. I'm Fred.
And I'm John. Thank you very much.
John. And we're going to do something very different today. And John is going to take the lead. I'm just going to be the peanut gallery. We're going to talk about Australia. And so my first question to John is, even though I know the answers, but you don't out there, why Australia, John?
Fred, I'm wearing my Akubra Australian hat, made especially in Australia. I'm going to leave it off for a second because for all those Australians down there that I met through 1965 through 1972, this is the John Graham you may have known. I was maybe a little younger then, but this is me without the Australian hat on.
That's 60 years ago.
Yeah, that's a long time ago, mate.
Mate.
So I'm going to call this and rename it a little bit and call it the Australian-American Connection. Because Fred, you and I talk a lot about connections, and we mean connections between people.
Yes.
And I have to tell you, I had some really fabulous connections with Australia.
Well, looking forward to that.
So part of what I'm doing today is to dedicate this talk about Australia and my life and the time I lived in Australia to two important people who have since deceased. One is Dr. Cameron Rolfe Howlett, and the other one is Dr. Graham Morgan. Both of them were the godparents of my two daughters later on in life.
Wow.
So I'm sorry they passed away in 2022, but for those of you in Australia, especially Sydney, where they worked and operated and practiced, this is for them.
Dedicated to them.
Dedicated to them.
Very nice. Nice touch.
And really also to their children, whom I know, because Dr. Graham Morgan had twins, Alice and Hugh Morgan, and Rolfe had two sons, Andrew and Angus, and I became ultimately the godfather of Andrew. But we'll get into that later.
This is already sounding like very, very close friendships.
Very close friendships, over decades. So January 26th, Fred, is known in Australia as Australia Day.
Okay.
You want to know what that is?
Is
right?
that the corollary to 4th of July in America?
It is not, no, because it's not really an independence. It's
Oh.
really when January 26th is the national recognized holiday for when the first British fleet arrived in Sydney Cove, which is kind of on the south shore of Sydney Harbor, and planted the Union Jack and claimed it. Claimed
Approximately when would that have been? How far back are we going in history?
1788.
In the 18th century, okay.
Yep, 1788.
Okay.
However, my first day in Australia, my first Australia Day, which would be January 26th, was in 1965. Okay?
Wow.
I take that back. My first Australia Day was 1966 because I arrived in Sydney in 1965.
Okay.
So I arrived in Sydney on July 31st, 1965. So my first Australia Day would have been in 66.
Okay. And I'm sure you're getting ready to tell us why you went to Australia.
I was a young man then. In 65, I was 20. I would have been 23 in December of 65. I just graduated from Berkeley, and I'm going to go backwards in the story, and that'll help you understand.
Okay.
So I arrived in Sydney July 31st, and how did that happen? Well, I got there by flying from Auckland on Qantas Airways. That's the famous Australian airline, Qantas. Love it. And I arrived in Sydney, but before that, I'd been on a cargo ship. So I got to Auckland, New Zealand on a cargo ship.
Where did you start your trip?
Eureka, California.
Eureka, California, and you went on a ship
On
to
a
Australia?
ship. On a ship. So you're a parent, and you take your son from Sacramento, where my parents live, up the coast in California to Eureka, because your son's going to get on a cargo ship and work their way across to Auckland, New Zealand.
I'm hoping this was a big, sturdy ship.
It was a cargo ship. It was not a big liner. It was part of Columbia Line's cargo ships, and they loaded up in Eureka with redwood and other timbers to take to the South Pacific.
Were there many, other than yourself, people on it, other than cargo?
There were no passengers other than workers. So you had the the ship's mate and the purser and the captain, but the rest of us were Uber riders. That's German for Uber. You know what Uber is, right? That's like a stowaway or a workaway. Okay.
Fascinating.
So I worked my way across from California to Auckland, New Zealand, via Tahiti and Papeete, Tahiti. There's one stop in Tahiti.
I've said before, he's a globetrotter.
So that's a long way of saying, much happened in 1965 because I graduated from University of California in Berkeley. I really was supposed to go on to either dental school in St. Louis.
Oh.
I was also fascinated by doing an advanced degree or master's in psychology at the University of Madison,
Yeah,
Wisconsin.
You've mentioned that before.
Mentioned that before, and
it's my field.
Yeah, your field. I could have wound up being a counselor. Like
Yeah,
you.
right. Yeah.
But I instead, on the cargo ship, once I got to Australia and lived in Australia for a period of time, I said, I want to stay in Australia, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon in 1965, 66. I don't know how many Americans that age left the country and decided to live in another country.
What was the impetus for you going there? What was the...
That's a good story because my son-in-law, who was married to my sister, had been going to Australia for quite a few years in the late.
Your son-in-law married to your sister?
Yeah. My son-in-law.
No.
Brother-in-law.
Brother-in-law.
Yeah, my brother-in-law was married to my sister Marjorie, and he was an actuary.
Okay.
Really smart cookie, and he worked for a life insurance management association in, I think it was Nebraska. And he was an expert on statistics and developing death tables and payouts and risk factors for insurance companies.
I've always imagined that as a supremely boring job.
You'd be looking at a lot of data.
Crunching numbers all day.
It might be easier now with computers.
Yeah, right.
I don't think
Spreadsheets and computers.
they didn't have that then.
Excel and all this other stuff.
Yeah, so he traveled to Australia with Liama, the life insurance management company, to help Australian life insurance companies develop tables and look at their risk factors and look at their payouts, etc., and to make money as well as pay out money. And he became famous friends with an Australian by the name of John Burton. So he and John Burton discovered that they both had 2 children, about the same age. So there were occasions in the 60s when Warren, my brother-in-law, would come home with all these slides of Australia and the beaches and the city of Sydney and places he traveled. And I thought, oh, wow, this is really...
So it was the beauty of the country that first got its hooks in you.
I would say it was the beauty of the country and how Warren, my brother-in-law, talked about the individual Australians, how real they were, how personable they were, and how easy they were to do business with. So eventually, I think what happened is I asked my brother-in-law, hey, could I visit your friends in Sydney? After I graduate from college, could I maybe go to Australia?
This was a visit.
A visit. So he worked on that. He worked on John and Dawn Burton, the ones that had 2 children. And lo and behold, he arranged for me to stay with them if I got to Sydney. So that's the completion of the story. So
Okay.
I get on the ship in Eureka, get to Auckland, fly from Auckland to Sydney, and then Mr. Burton greets me at the airport at Kingsford Smith. I think it's Kingsford Smith Airport. He's a typical Australian businessman. He's got a moustache, well-groomed, dark suit tie. He looks at me, and you know what he said, Fred? He said, you look a little shaggy. I mean, I've been on board ship,
Oh, yeah.
no haircut.
Yeah.
I've been working out in the sun.
Yeah.
Hey, I shined the ship's bell. I chipped paint. I cleaned toilets. I was working my way across
Wow.
to Australia.
Wow.
So Mr. Burton said, I think the first thing for you is a haircut. So he took me to a barber shop and literally waited in the kind of the waiting area while I got a haircut to make me look
Presentable.
presentable. And then for those of you who know anything about Sydney or love Sydney, he took me, this is back in the 60s, 1960s, last century.
Yep.
He took me to what's called the AMP building, which was the tallest building in Sydney at that time. And he said, I'm going to drop you off here and you walk around, look around, walk around town, around the city, and I'll meet you back here in the lobby of the AMP building. But go up top and take pictures and look around the city and look at the harbor bridge and look at the bay and everything. So I did that.
Go sightseeing.
You go sightseeing. So ultimately, Mr. Burton and I became great friends together with his wife. And Fred, I probably lived with them for 4, 5, or 6 months. And one of the things that I think interest our viewers is that I learned about the Australian drinking schools and pubs.
Drinking schools?
You know what a drinking school is not really about education.
Oh, it's college, but they drink themselves half to.
Well, but this is just a drinking school and a pub. So there's a big difference. But there's no education involved in the school and a pub.
Okay.
I'll explain.
You lost me, so yeah, please explain.
So Mr. Burton would pick me up maybe someplace in Sydney, or I'd meet him at his office. He had an office in Surrey Hills, another suburb, where he was in the printing business, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
So it was traditional for him to go to the pub every day after work.
Okay.
So he would take me to the pub. And
That's
I
a
would,
big fabric of their social life.
Yes, oh, big fabric. Oh, gosh. And occasionally I would maybe overdrink. Not too much, but I had transport. I wasn't,
Be honest now.
I wasn't driving. But I do know that I came home with Mr. Burton a couple of times and slept until the next morning until I
Yeah.
went out and did something.
Slept it off.
They lived in a lovely suburb of St. Ives, which is on the North Shore. Anyway, John would take me to these schools where he met other business people in the pub, and they would be maybe 2 or 3 people, and then I would be there, and then somebody else would join. The first thing you know, there's 4, 5, 6 people in the pub. So the Australian school is you have to have, if there's 5 of you in the group, then you have to have at minimum 5 beers. Because everybody has to buy a round of, you have to shout. It's called a shout.
Okay.
Because it gets loud in the pub. You're in a group of 4, 5, 6, or 10. And to get the bartender's attention, you have to shout, over here we need 10 beers, 5 beers, 6 beers.
Yeah.
Okay?
I didn't think you were going to tell this part of the story.
This goes on for quite a few days, quite a few months. And eventually I figured out that, hey, this can get, could be expensive. And there's a lot of drinking going on here. You know, it's like not just go to the pub with Mr. Burton and have a beer.
Yeah.
There's no such thing.
Right.
You go to school. You have a school of
Yeah,
drinkers.
I see. I get it now.
No
Thanks
education.
for filling in the
No,
gaps.
no education.
Education and drinking beer.
But the time came, Fred, and every Australian will understand this who's had a guest and taken them to a pub for many, many, many weeks, and their guest didn't pay or buy a shout. One day he turned to me, he said, John, I know everybody enjoys you being the American and the only guest here in the group, but you're going to have to start buying a round of beers, mate. Because for weeks and months I never paid for a round.
Yeah.
Oh, there's Graham, you know, the American, let's talk to him, talk.
Yeah.
The beers kept coming.
And they kept treating.
I thought, this is good.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah.
Life is
Perfect
good.
setup. Life is good in Australia.
But eventually I had to pay up.
Pay up. Pay the piper.
So after that, I finally decided, basically in late 65, that, you know what, I really like Australia. I'm not going to come back to the States for dental school. I'm not going to come back to the States to do psychology. My parents were highly disappointed, highly, highly disappointed, as was my sister and brother-in-law. But I decided to stay there and apply for medical school. So I had several friends that I'd met on the side, apart from Burton, that were doctors and physicians, and they said, well, why don't you, if you're interested in dental school and maybe you ought to do psychiatry, why don't you stay here in Australia and look at medicine? But I found out real quick that you couldn't just do that in the 60s and 70s. You had to be a permanent resident in Australia.
Oh.
So I went to Sydney University and talked with the administration there and the admission office, and they were actually very friendly and kind about it and said, yeah, we maybe have only had a couple of Americans ever attend Sydney University Medical School, but you can't do that unless you're a permanent resident.
I see.
So they told me how to go about becoming a permanent resident, and they helped me fill out the paperwork. And ultimately, the conclusion was I did apply to go to medical school at University of Sydney Medical School after I became a permanent resident, after I had my visa for that, which meant I could work and also go to school.
Everything's coming together.
Everything's
like
coming
a
together.
tapestry.
Like a tapestry. The only hookup was, or hang up, is that because of my degree from college, I had already taken biology and physiology and physics, and that was the first year of the medical school program out of 6. The British and the Australians have a 6-year medical program. And the first year is basically an extension of an expansion on sciences and biology and physics. And so when I got to the point of matriculating, which is entering medical school, the medical board said, well, we can put you into the medical school, but you can't start this year because you
Already had these courses.
always have these courses. So you have to wait a year and start next year.
Okay, what'd you do then?
So then I went to work for the New South Wales Education Department. I went down to the Education Department location, the headquarters in Sydney, and introduced myself, filled out an application. I had a work permit, and got a job as a mental survey tester.
Mental survey tester.
Mental survey tester. And what that allowed me to do was have the Australian New South Wales government send me into the outback. I didn't stay in Sydney.
Now we're going to the Outback, folks.
Now we're going to the outback.
Yeah. I just ate at the Outback restaurant the other day with my daughter.
Fabulous. Did you have the bloomin' onion?
No, I skipped the bloomin' onion.
What I soon learned was that I was being sent to whoop Australia. That means way out in the outback.
Uh-huh.
I went to places like Armidale and Narrabri and Tamworth and Moree. People in Australia will know these locations. They're kind of north and west in Australia. To test Aboriginal students. I pretty much only was sent to Aboriginal schools. The government was trying to educate Aboriginals.
Yeah.
And I was sent there to give them a Stanford Binet mental survey testing.
I know of it. Sounds very worthwhile.
Yes, but I'm
helping these people out.
But I'm testing Aboriginals, and they don't know anything about white man's culture.
Oh.
And so I'm administering the tests to them. And what's the Magna Carta? What's this? What's that? They don't know. They don't know. Even trying to assess them was difficult because I might be in one school for a week or 10 days, and the class size would be 22, and then the next day would be 10, because if their dad went walkabout or had to go shear sheep on a station, they're gone.
Yeah.
Then they come back.
Yeah.
It was back and forth, and the teachers had a very difficult time doing planning. But hats off to the Australian New South Wales government. They were trying to get the Aboriginal children educated, kind of organized, and
it's well intended.
It was all well intended.
But they have to be there.
But they have to be there. But their livelihood often meant hourly jobs and hourly wages on big stations, which are big sheep farms. So I spent a lot of time outside of Sydney in small pubs, small hotels, small motels, by myself. I think in a way it may have been one of the first times I ever experienced loneliness.
You read my mind. I was just thinking, of were you homesick, were you lonely, and then you said it.
I don't think I recognized it as much as at the time until I started looking backwards over those months and that year or so. That it was pretty stark. You know, I was an American. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know. I mean, they speak English, but Australian is a lot of lingo and
Yeah.
difficulty understanding what they're saying. And it meant being in a pub many times because it was less expensive to stay there, and my expenses were being paid for by the New South Wales Education Department.
Oh, they were. Oh.
So they expected me to stay in inexpensive locations.
Yeah, sure.
So I would say it was a period of time when I was pretty much on my own, and I didn't really go to church as much as I should have. I remember going to church a couple of times, but it all felt kind of foreign to me. I was in the country, dusty roads, dirt roads, undeveloped little villages, and I just felt kind of out of it. And so I just did my job.
Sounds like you were isolated.
I was isolated. That's a good phrase for it. Yeah. I just kind of did my job and hoped for getting back to Sydney. So eventually I was accepted into University of Sydney and went
After you established your was it called?
a residence visa. Yeah.
Residence visa.
So right in the early parts of living in Australia, even when I was working with the New South Wales Education Department, I had the luxury and beautiful experience of living in Neutral Bay, Cremorne Bay. These are lovely little areas right off of Sydney Harbour, very close to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the big U-shaped bridge, which the Aussies call the coat hanger bridge. And you would take
Like we have the Big Dipper.
like the Big Dipper. You would take a ferry over to Circular Quay to get into the city. So it was very picturesque to get on the ferry in the morning and ride over to the New South Wales Education Department. Or when I was in Sydney, I lived in Neutral Bay or Cremorne. And after I got into medical school, I had done some research on where to live in Sydney, and the university admission office put me in touch with different colleges. I didn't know what a college is. Do you know what a college is in a university?
Within the university? No.
Well, in the British system, they often have Catholic colleges, Anglican colleges, other religious colleges that assemble in living groups, usually all males or all women, kind of like a dorm, I guess, in a sense, only they usually have a purpose and they have a mission. They're spiritually sometimes associated with a religion, and they have a structured tutoring system and people who they hire to tutor the students.
Well.
So I wound up, after the advice of the admission office, to apply to live in St. Paul's College, which St. Paul's is an Anglican based college. About 150, 160 students, all male. They had graduate students there who were teaching and tutoring those who were maybe in veterinary medicine. They had graduates who were tutoring in medicine, etc. It was a really wonderful living experience. A couple of asides there, Fred. The college is kind of formal situation. You have to wear, at nighttime to go to dinner, you had to wear a black robe, dress up, coat and tie.
Yeah.
And it was like being ladies and gents. You had to be you had to be a gentleman.
Yeah.
And if you were an upperclassman, you could go to a specific room and have a sherry before dinner. Then to the dining hall. It's a great big dining hall, stone-filled dining hall. And if you were an upperclassman, you could go from there to have a port after dinner.
It sounds like a movie.
It sounded like a movie. It was. And St. Paul's, by the way, for those in Australia who know about St. Paul's College, the graduates of University of Sydney who lived at St. Paul's are called Paulines. And St. Paul's actually boasts prime ministers, assistant prime ministers, Supreme Court justices, a lot of important people have lived at St. Paul's College. Not me included, but I did live there a few years. One thing I'll say about University of Sydney Medical School, and you know, I'm so pro-Australian for many, many reasons, but the bottom line is, Fred, with the medical school and my experience there, I became a physician.
Yeah.
So I have an indebtedness to the Australian people and to their culture and to them allowing me to partake of their culture and to be involved with their education system. Otherwise, I would not have been a physician.
Yeah.
That's a really added benefit from living there. Now I'll go back to my two friends who's deceased, Graham Morgan and Rolf Hallett. Eventually, they were living in a row home in Paddington, New South Wales, which is in the center of the city. Mm-hmm. And I was living in St. Paul's, and so I decided to move out of St. Paul's after several years and live in a non-university type location, residence.
Okay. Oh, you had that option?
Had that option. Mm-hmm. So I moved in with them, and the three of us lived in the 161 Paddington Street while I finished up my medicine degree. And my parents came to visit me and actually stayed in 161 Paddington Street in Paddington.
Were they proud of you by now?
They were proud of me by then. Yes, they were.
I had an inkling.
Those are really fascinating years, working at different hospitals and training. I worked at the Sydney Hospital, which was the main hospital in Sydney. I worked at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, as well
Royal Prince Albert Hospital?
Royal Prince Albert Hospital, and King George V Hospital, which was the hospital for mothers and babies.
Okay, so I have a question.
Yeah.
When you go to medical school, is it like when you're going, you haven't already picked a specialty? You pick if you're going to specialize in something, you pick that after you get your medical degree?
Yes.
And if you're going to be a GP, a family doctor, you decide that after you finish your medical degree? So that, my point is, everybody gets the same medical education, then they kind of decide what they're going to do with it.
Yes.
Okay.
That would be a good assumption, because you have to do additional years, even in family medicine, or especially if you're going to be ear, nose, and throat, or if you're going to be...
Right. That's what I meant by specialties. Yeah.
OBGYN is how I wound up.
And that sounds like a good segue into what you chose.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that probably influenced me about becoming an obstetrician and gynecologist, Fred, is that one of the terms I had in fifth year medicine was an unallocated term, meaning you had several months where you could go overseas to do work-related, medical-related experience. So some of the people in my class went to Malaysia, some went to Europe, some came to the States. I chose to go to Singapore, because one of my good friends that I met at St. Paul's College, E.K. Wong, his family lived in Singapore, and we became good friends when I lived at St. Paul's College. And he said, why don't you go to Singapore? It's fascinating. They have a big hospital there called Kandang Caribou. Kandang Caribou. It's been shortened to KK. So if you go to...
I told you he was a globetrotter.
If you go to Singapore and say, take me to KK Hospital, they'll know what you're talking about. It's a hospital for women and babies and newborns.
Okay.
Well, in the 1960s, I think it was 1963, Singapore became liberated from Britain. And so a lot of changes occurred in terms of birth control and how they handled women after that became more liberal. And just to be in Singapore and to be attending that hospital on a day-to-day basis for several months was unbelievable. Just seeing diseases that you would see multiples of. It was such a huge place, and people were brought in from all around the island of Singapore to KK.
Okay.
And so in 1 week you might see a dozen cases of cancer of the ovary, or you might see certain type of uterine disease as you might see once a year someplace else.
Yeah.
You'd see 8 or 10 cases.
Yeah. Now, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Do I hear correctly that Singapore is a very beautiful place?
Oh, absolutely beautiful. And they're cleanly. They take care of the city, the
environment,
streets, the city, the streets. In the evening times, a lot of the commercial district just shuts down, and they bring in tables, and they cook and people sit down and eat, and it becomes like a big street fair.
How long of a time did you spend in Singapore?
I was in Singapore for approximately 3 months, living with E.K. Wong's family. That was an extraordinary experience, and I think I could say this now since E.K. Wong's father is since deceased. He was a physician, and he was known, Fred, in and throughout Singapore as the venereal disease doctor,
Oh,
the VD doctor.
yeah.
And I say that in a good way because a lot of the women or individuals who contracted venereal disease were shunned and weren't they weren't able to get into a lot
They
of
were
clinics.
ostracized.
They were ostracized. But Dr. Wong really made it a point to have his clinic open, and so he was open shop for anybody, male or female, who had some sort of venereal
Good
disease.
for him.
Yeah, it was interesting to live with him.
Compassionate man.
Very compassionate. The last thing I'll say about the hospital experience and living in Sydney is that the fun-loving Australians would have hospital follies, where the physicians make fun of themselves, and the nurses make fun of the physicians, and they all fight because they're always at each other's throats, the nurses and the doctors.
Is this in an amicable way or?
In an
Oh
amicable
yeah.
way.
Right.
So you would put on
Good, clean fun.
you'd put on skits, and people would buy tickets to come and see the doctors in training.
Buy tickets.
Buy tickets, yeah, to support the hospital or
Oh,
to support the training program.
I see.
Well, I have to say, I participated in 2 skits. One was, of course, I had a white coat on, and I was an obstetrician, and I had a stethoscope around my neck. And they had a gurney with a woman on it, with a pillow on her tummy with a sheet. And they would roll her in. She was screaming, saying, "I'm in labor, I'm in labor, I'm in labor." And I would pull the sheet up and put my hand underneath it and say, "You're not ready yet." Then they'd push her off, and I'd get ready to see the next patient. "Oh, Dr. Graham, can you see so-and-so?" "Oh, I'm in labor, I'm in labor." So they'd roll her back in from the other direction. I'd pick up the sheet, reach underneath and say, "You're not ready yet." And she'd scream and yell. So I get ready to see the next patient, and then here comes the gurney again. Same story. Well, after about 4 times of that, of "you're not ready yet," the last part of that skit was this lady would walk in, and there would be a little boy. She would holding hands with a little boy. And I'd say, "Oh, I remember you. Did you have your labor?" And she said, "Yeah, this is my son. He's going to school now. You missed it. You missed the delivery."
You must have had a blast.
I was talking about VD, so I have to tell this other story. I was
Okay.
also a doctor in a skit, and they had patients coming in to see me for various complaints. And this really sultry woman, they have her all dressed up as a real sultry lady with a slinky dress on, and she comes in and says something about, "I have a rash, I have a big rash on my arm." And so I look at her arms, and there's these big red blotches and everything. And I said, "Well, that's interesting. How'd you get that?" She says, "I don't know, but I have sex many times with people." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, you have a rash?" She said, "Yes, I have a rash." I said, "Well, let me open the book." So I opened the book up and check out what the rash could be. And I said to her, "Well, it could be measles. It could be mumps. Others might call it syphilis. And it's too late now. So here's some penicillin. You go home."
Oh boy.
That got a lot of laughs.
Oh boy.
Maybe not today.
Yeah, maybe not today. Yeah. It's not politically correct.
So this is where I'm going to wind down and say, I'm so blessed to have known a lot of Australians, especially the 2 godfathers of my daughters, and then to have become the godfather of one of my mate's sons too.
Sure.
Actually helped deliver Andrew as well. Mm-hmm. So 161 Paddington, those of you who live in Sydney area and know Paddington, Australia, it's a totally unique little place with art galleries. And
How long a
restaurants.
time were you there in total?
The total stay in Australia was about 8 years,
8
close
years.
close to 9, before I came back to America.
Okay.
And that will be another.
And that'll be another video because you came back, and if I recall, you did a residency in Baltimore.
I did.
Maybe
Baltimore.
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 Maybe we'll pick up from there in our next video.
Well, I'd love to, Fred.
Okay. So my last note, yes, my last note was, will there be more about Australia? And the answer is, oh yes.
Oh yes.
Great job.
Thank you. That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.